We are moving away from our introductory Module 1 and into Module 2, where we're going to study sculpture and architecture. So today, particularly, we're looking at sculpture, and I'm excited to dive in and start applying some of what we've learned to this new area of the humanities. So, without further ado, what is sculpture? So a sculpture is a mass extending into space. So unlike what we've talked about so far, I think we've touched a little on, we've looked at a couple of paintings, we've looked at some photography, but a sculpture is a mass. It has 3D form, which means it has bulk, it has weight, and it has what we would call density. So those are some terms that you'll see when we start to approach sculpture. Is it dense? How weighty does it seem, or is it? How 3D is it in form? Sculpture also often invites us to view it from several different positions. So depending on how 3D it is, we might be able to either turn it if it's small, or if it's a big sculpture, we could walk around and view it from different vantage points. And it might look different depending on where you stand or where you view it from. The next important thing to know about sculpture is that it features sensuous qualities. That's not sensual, it's sensuous, meaning it appeals to the senses. Sensuous is senses. So sculpture should have some tactile qualities to it. It should kind of invite us to reach out and touch it. So, if you see something metal, there might be an element of temperature to that. If the room is cold, then the sculpture might feel cold. If it's outside in the sun, it might be screaming hot. It might be bumpy. It could be smooth. And so it does appeal to our sense of touch. And unlike painting or photography, with a sculpture, we can't view it all at one time often enough, especially if it's very 3D. We'll talk about a sculpture in the round in just a second. But often we can't see everything there is to see all at once. It usually will invite us to see things from different perspectives. So we can look at this example from Jean Arp. This is called Growth, 1939. And this is what we would call abstract sculpture. And we're going to talk more about this concept of abstract work. But to give you a little bit of an introduction, an abstract painting, it can only represent something that's dense or has density, but a sculpture can actually present density. We can actually see it, we can actually feel it. And when it comes to abstract work, the difference between abstract and what we would call representational work is that a representational work, meaning you're trying to make or create something, copy something you've seen somewhere else, something that exists in the world. So for example, let's say I did a sculpture of a lamp, or a sculpture of, that's not a great example. Let's see, a sculpture of, I'm looking around my room here, sculpture of a pen. Okay, I'm going to do a sculpture of a pen. That would be representational because a pen is a real thing that exists in the world, and I'm going to try to represent it in my work. Now, abstract work means you are not trying to represent something that exists in the world. It is often metaphorical, it could be symbolic, or it could just be meant to engage your senses. So it's not trying to represent anything real in the world. So when we look at something abstract, sometimes we get frustrated because we say, it doesn't look like anything, because we're wanting it to be representational, but it doesn't always have to be. So this particular work is abstract. And in this case, the primary subject matter is the density and what we would call the sensa, or just the ability to engage with the senses. Now, I do think there's something really interesting to this when we think about the title. What do you think of when you look at this sculpture? What does it look like to you? Obviously, we're not in class together, but a lot of students have, in my class before, have said it looks like a bone. And it's really interesting because it doesn't look like a bone that you would see on an x-ray. It's not trying to represent an actual bone, but there's something interesting about this title, which kind of gives us a hint about growth. And when we grow as people, we may not always grow in a linear line. God may take us to the left a little bit and we may grow that way. And then God might say, I want you to change course. I want you to go and grow in this direction. And so we might grow in this other direction. And when we look back on our life, we can see we've had immense growth, but maybe it wasn't all in a straight line. So I think there's really something interesting here about this idea of growth. And this is an example of an abstract sculpture. Okay, so let's think about sculpture and space. Whenever you come across any, art critic or just anyone making a comment about sculpture, they're usually going to discuss the use of space. So a painting is usually separated from real space by a frame, but sculpture doesn't have any boundaries. A sculpture there's a space between you and the viewer, and the sculpture itself. And what we call that is the in-between. So how does the sculpture take up space? Even if we're not touching the sculpture, we can sense that it has a shape because it is permeating and changing the shape of the space in between us. It is a sensory experience. So, it's going to cast shadows. It's going to be concave in some places. It might be convex in some places. So in a lot of ways, it's using space. It's shaping the space around it. So this is common terminology when you're discussing sculpture. How is it using the space? There's a few different types of, essentially levels of being 3D, if you will, with sculpture. So I'm going to start with the most 2D of those, and then we'll kind of work our way up. So this is what's called sunken relief. This is a temple carving in Egypt. You can tell it's probably Egyptian. This is sunken. So that means that the sculptures itself are not projecting into space. They're not coming towards me. They're actually going away from me. They're projecting inward. So it's sunken. So we could look at this and think about how does the light work here against the sandstone. Obviously, there's been some shaping done here. If you look at, like, for instance, the calves of these people, you can see that they're actually rounded a bit so that when the light hits them, they look a little bit more 3D. Really interesting. When we look at this, it might feel a bit more weighty. We might say, oh, this is very dense because the relief, the sculptures they're not free from the material. They are very much dense and part of that stone. So it feels kind of weighty to us. We feel the substance of it, but it's still kind of essentially a 2D artifact. So let's compare that now with low relief. Low relief. So this sculpture, this is from 1984. You could probably tell because of the colors. This is a medium relief or a low relief sculpture, and it projects slightly from the background plane. It's actually fixed to the background, so you can't walk around to the back of it. You can walk to the right, to the left a little bit, and as you do that, you're going to get a completely different perspective of this work. So there's limited depth perception and probably still best viewed from the front because it's tied to that background plane. But now we can look at something that's high relief. High relief means it's even more set free from the background plane, but we still can't walk around to the back of it. So it's more three-dimensional, but not 100% three-dimensional. We have a greater sense of these figures, what the mass of them is, and we might get slightly different perspectives if we stand more to the right or to the left. And then lastly, we have sculpture in the round, and this is where the sculpture is completely set free from a background plane. There is no background plane. We can view it from any angle. We can view it from 360 degrees. We have a full sense of the density and the mass in this sculpture. And we really get a sense, and it makes sense for a dancer to be in a sculpture in the round. She needs to be free. She can't be tied to a plane. So we have this sense that she's kind of posed and ready to start moving. She might do a pirouette from here. We don't know. But this work here, this is Edgar Degas. He is very famous for paintings and sculptures of ballet dancers. This is from 1880. So I would just invite you to take a look at this one if this is one that you enjoy. All right. Now we're going to move on to the idea of truth to materials. This is a common theme that you'll see in your book, your textbook, chapter 5. So the material, we talked about the medium this last week. The medium matters. And so the question when it comes to sculpture is, should a sculptor work within the confines of the material that he's using, or should he work against it? So we're going to look at a few examples of works that go either way. This is Henry Moore. His work is called Recumbent Figure. It is made out of stone and bronze. And so this might be an example of a truth to materials example here. So for example, it still looks like stone, doesn't it? I mean, even though it's kind of made into be like the shape of a person, it still looks like stone. And so for someone who shows truth to materials, this is a quote from Moore. He would say, "Stone, for example, is hard and concentrated and should not be falsified to look like soft flesh. It should keep its hard, tense stoniness." So even though it is a figure, it still looks like stone. So this is showing truth to materials. Now let's look at this. This is Jeff Koons. It's called Balloon Dog, and it was put famously on display at Versailles when this photo was taken. He is an artist who works against his materials, maybe not all the time, but certainly in this case. And there's a lot of irony to his work. So when you think of stainless steel, is that synonymous with a balloon? I mean, I don't think so. Obviously, maybe it could be shiny. But stainless steel, we think of something that's really heavy and blocky and definitely not something light like a balloon. So this might be an example of something that does not show truth to materials. Look at something like this. Would you say this is true or not true to materials? I think you could go either way on this. Your text calls this reverent to wood. And we can also think about sculpture that is true to materials as a type of protest against technology, because technology is kind of pushing those boundaries. And there's a sense that, what's natural shouldn't be or doesn't need to be improved. So it's kind of like a stone should look like stone, and steel should look like steel, and wood should look like wood. We don't need technology, to change our materials. We need to just be true to them as they are. So speaking of technology, I'm going to show you a few images here from your text that kind of fall under this category of protest against technology. A lot of this in the last probably 60 or 70 years for people who lived through several wars, a cultural revolution. And so this one here is called a study, Falling Man or Wheel Man. This is from 1965. This is considered a protest against technology. So I want you to think about that and look at that here and think about what about this is maybe protesting technology. Well, we can see that the man is stuck in a wheel, and that might remind you maybe of a hamster on a wheel, right? He's running and running but not going anywhere. He's maybe a prisoner to technology. We could think about his posture, his stance. He's got a bit of a gut, probably not the idealized body type, right? And so we can think about maybe, do we get lazy because of technology? Are we less active because of technology? And is it really getting us anywhere? So these might be questions that might come up as we're looking at something like this sculpture. Here's another one. This is called Bronze Crowd. And this is done, I believe it's a Polish artist. And we can see this is actually a tribute to, I believe it was Polish. I don't have my textbook right in front of me, but I want to say this was Polish soldiers, and kind of a statement of what happened after occupation. And you can see that there's sort of this battering that's taken place, this weathering that's taken place. And you'll note that there's no heads on any of these statues. What do we think that means? So there's some really great things to explore here. Here's another one, Giacometti. This is called City Square. Okay, we could think about kind of the modern era. This was 1948. This was created. Think about when that was. What happened recently after right before 1948? And we could think about the texture here, right? Everything's kind of beaten up and weathered, like those statues we just looked at. There's a number of people, but are they connected? Are they near each other? Or are they all living their lives independently and far apart? So something to think about. There's some kind of dystopian tones to this. If technology is possible, if atomic bombs are possible, what could they lead to? And are they good for our society? Are they not good for our society? So there's comments probably being made here. I also wanted to show you an example of earth sculpture. In an earth sculpture, the earth itself is not only the site, but it's also the medium and the subject matter. So this is about the earth, made with earth, and it's located on earth, of course. So this is an example of earth sculpture. Lastly, I was going to show you this example of sculpture in public places. This is the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And if you've ever been there, you can see kind of where you walk through over there on the right side. You start there and then you walk further in. And it's difficult to see on this PowerPoint, but there are names listed on those black panels, names of soldiers who died in Vietnam. And it's intentionally done to where as you walk, the further you walk, the greater the list of names grows, the larger it grows. And so it's meant to have this impact on you of the further in we go, the more people we lose. And again, another comment on the war of Vietnam. And you're meant to be overwhelmed by the number of soldiers that were lost in this war. So again, art having a comment, right? Having content. We talked about content. Maybe this is about war, but what about war? And so now that we've engaged with it, the lines and the scale of the names that we're seeing, that is saying something about war. So that's how we arrive at content. Okay. As we're looking toward our next chapter, we'll be looking at architecture. So one of the key questions I want to distinguish is what's the difference between sculpture and architecture? Because they are very similar in some ways. They both have mass, they are both dense, they both use space, but the difference is that sculpture has no functional inner space. We can't go inside a sculpture and walk around or use it for some function, but architecture does. It does have functional inner space. We can enter inside, we can use it for something, we can, a home, it has functional inner space. A hotel, it has functional inner space. A temple. So those things would qualify as architecture. This is an example of something that is both architecture and sculpture. The Sphinx itself has no usable space. It's purely decorative. You can't go inside. And so that part of this, the Sphinx, is sculpture. But the pyramid behind it, that was used as a burying place for the dead. So it was functional. Now today, its function is more limited. So, you could certainly bring up the fact, you could say, well, it's not functional anymore. So now is it a sculpture? And so that's a great question to ask. And your text says, that the arts resist neat pigeonholing. Attempts at pigeonholing things are futile. So it's certainly a valid question that you could bring up. Okay. If we were in class together, I would have you take some time to compare some statues of David. So if you have a few moments and you want to just go through this exercise yourself, you can. But I think it's kind of interesting to compare 4 different depictions of David from the Bible. And it's interesting too to think about what values might be expressed and how they change with each rendition. This one here is Bernini. This was done in the Baroque period, which we'll talk a little bit about when we get to architecture. But the Baroque is very much characterized by exuberance. It's very over the top. It's heavy on emotion and motion. And so you can definitely see that in this sculpture. You can see the concentration on David's face. Even the moment that's been chosen, he looks like he's in mid-swing. He's about to let go of that slingshot. So this is a moment of high action. Now we can look at these other depictions of David, and we can see that they're very, very different. So we have Donatello's version here on the left, and he looks very childlike, sort of passive, almost a little feminine. And you can see at the feet is the head of David. So this moment that's being depicted is a little bit later in time in this Goliath and David showdown. And so that is one aspect to consider. We look at Verrocchio, and same thing in terms of the timing here. We see Goliath's head at his feet, so Goliath's already been slain. But look at the posture and look at the age difference. He looks more like an adolescent and less like a child. David looks more confident. He's a little more muscular. He's got a hand on the hip. He just looks more confident. All right. Then we can look at Michelangelo. His depiction, and David is a man at this point. He's a grown adult, and there's no head of Goliath at his feet. And so this is meant to be the moment before he throws the rocks and the slingshot. He's kind of appraising the situation. He's looking at Goliath, sizing him up, and he's about to let it swing. So there's some really interesting thoughts here behind the cultural values that were important to each of these artists. They're also a little bit different in time. Donatello being the earliest, then Verrocchio, then Michelangelo, and then Bernini would be last because that would be more like 1600s. So you can see sort of how cultural values change and what's important and what we should celebrate. All right, so here's Bernini's David. Oh, I forgot I had a slide on this. There we go, 1673. Okay, so we're going to wrap up for now. As you are kind of putting these in practice, find a sculpture in your textbook and practice using some of these terms. Who created your sculpture? Practice describing it. Take time to make a list of what you see. The humanities, when you're studying these works of art, it doesn't necessarily come in 2 seconds. You need to take your time a little bit. So wrestle with it, see what you see, identify what do you think is the subject matter, what was the medium used, and then after you look at all the form, what do you think is the content? What meaning do you see? So I want you to practice that this week as you are doing sculpture. And so stay tuned. We are going to prep here now for our next video on architecture. Don't forget Tuesday, you've got your learning exercise due, that practice discerning and describing art. You can go ahead and crack open chapter 6 to get ready for architecture. And you can look over the key characteristics of Gothic architecture, which I'm going to touch on a little bit in that next video. Thanks for joining and have a great week.